Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Good to talk to you. I have to say, it does my heart good. Recently, we have had people clamoring for this show to come out. We get tweets, we get emails. When is it coming out? When are the suits at blogging heads, the high-paid executives who care about the ratings and the timing and stuff? When are they going to post it? So
You know, I think the clamor is only coming from uh, southern DMZ. I don't think it's coming from northern DMZ. I think there is the conservative half of the fan base is waiting to see how drenched my shirt gets in tears. Whereas the liberal side of DMZ, I think, like many on the left, are in a voluntary media blackout and are tuning as much out as they possibly can.
Well, I can tell you, I don't know if anyone else experienced this, but I on election day, I lost some followers, um, and it's the only time I've noticed it happening ever. I think, and I think you know what I compare it to. After the Orioles got knocked out of the playoffs, I every once in a while I would get like a tweet from the Orioles or something on Facebook, and I'm just like, okay, the season's over. I don't want to hear any more about it. You guys lost. I'll hit you up again next spring. And so I think maybe it was people who were like Hillary supporters who liked my criticism of Trump, and then once Trump won, that's my theory that some of them just like I don't want to see anything to do with politics. I don't want to hear anything about politics, and they unfollowed.
Well, you've taken a tack. I think you wrote about this. You are taking the tack that it's time for America to unite around Trump. We should not wish for his failure. We should not try
Yeah.
to undercut him. His success is our success. Do you think that perhaps might be fueling that reaction?
I don't think so because this happened, earlier than that. Like that's been my message in the week since election day. But this happened almost immediately on election day, before I started really preaching my conciliatory kumbaya message. By the way, if Hillary Clinton had won, I would be saying the same thing. Now, I would be saying we should fight her on policy when she's wrong, but I would also be saying she is our president or our president elect. We need to be, the election's over. Let's, we need to respect the office, and so the fact is, I was not, I was never a Trump supporter, but I do now think that he has won. Yes, I know he didn't win the popular vote. Feel free to tweet me that he didn't win the popular vote. That's
I
the other thing
have.
that bothers. That's the thing that bothers me about these people, Bill, is when I say something. There's basically three responses that people give when I say, "Look, Trump won. We should be rooting for his success." Number one, people will say, "Well, he didn't win the popular vote." So, and I think that's sort of pedantic and irrelevant. Like, look, he won fair and square. He is. We have an electoral college. We've always had an electoral college. He is the president. So go ahead and make that distinction if you feel that it's absolutely necessary. But to me, it's beside the point. The other thing people say is that they want revenge. Like, well, you guys didn't give Barack Obama a fair shake, so why should we give Trump a fair shake? To which I say we can argue as to the Mitch McConnell thing is misrepresented. He said I want him to be a one-termer after he'd been in office for 2 years. But either way,
So
do you
the
want to
voting
do
records are still clear. There was not a whole lot of crossover voting over the 8-year period.
if we were to concede and accept the premise that Republicans from day one were trying to stop the president, then we can ask the question: how did that work out? Was it good for America? Was it even good for the Republican Party? And should that be replicated if you care about the country? And then the third thing I would bring up are people who say, Well, I'm not. I can't root. I'll root for America, but I can't root for him because of his bad policies. And I think that's an acceptable and defensible position. But I would say this: it's basically what Rush Limbaugh said when he said, "I hope he fails," and everybody freaked out about that. So that's kind of where I'm at on this right now. Like, I wasn't for Trump ever, but I think it would be nice if he succeeded and had a successful presidency. We need it. We need a win. America.
I don't think anyone wants to see people suffer. No one wants to see the economy collapse. No one wants to see people die in unnecessary wars. But I think it is fair to point out, as it was pointed out with Bill Clinton in '92 and George W. Bush in 2000. In those two cases, he was under 50. He's under 50%, like they were. Like Bush, but not like Clinton, he did not have the most votes. So right now he's at 46.9 in David Wasserman's National Popular Vote Tracker. That number's expected to continue to tick down as more California votes come in, but I think there might be about 3-4 million votes left. But this is all estimates, of course. I mean, I'm not saying he didn't win fair and square. He won fair and square. I understand that the Electoral College exists. I'm not saying that we should forget that. But it's also appropriate to say most of America did not want this. There was a poll that came out today in the Washington Post that 29% of Americans think that Trump has a mandate, and over 50% thinks he should compromise with Democrats. Those are fair things to point out, that this is not a blessing for the rhetoric and the policies that he ran on.
Yeah, I would say a couple of quick things about that. Number one, I think if you're a Republican, you should be assuming if you're in the Trump administration, you should be thinking we do not have a mandate. We have got to persuade, and most people didn't vote for us, and we need to remember that. If you're a Democrat, I think it's a dangerous thing to think about that. I think if you're a Democrat, you need to think we lost the Electoral College and we have a real problem. And I will say, I think the left is in freak out mode. I mean, Republicans, I wrote a whole book about the Republican schism and the identity crisis. Republicans were prepared to lose much more than Democrats were. For Democrats, this is like a sudden death in the family that nobody saw coming. And I think that they're really freaking out. And I'm seeing think pieces it's making Slate look like Salon. Things like, let's get rid of the Electoral College. Things like, the whole concept of statehood is antiquated. We don't even need states. And then the other one, which was, there is no such thing as a good Trump voter. And by the way, Bill, I interviewed, on my podcast, I interviewed my mom, who lives in Pennsylvania. Never had her on my podcast before, never interviewed her before. Unlike her son, she did vote for Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, and I had a whole interview where I asked her questions like, how could you support this guy who said these things about women? How could you support this guy who said these things about Hispanics? And I thought it was very enlightening and telling. And but my mom also does an incredible amount of volunteer work and philanthropic work, and I think anybody who listens to it will know that she is a very good person and that she voted for Donald Trump. But I think the left right now is in freak out mode, and I think that it's actually going to be, there's a danger that this is going to be counterproductive for them, that rather than accept the fact that they lost this election and that they've got work to do with working class white voters, that they're going to go the other direction. I'm seeing things tweeted out by radical feminists and sort of people who and here's the other thing too, is that some of these people who write these think pieces are on Sunday morning TV shows and will probably end up at the New York Times or the Washington Post and saying radical things right now. And I think that there's no way that a conservative who said anything on the right of equal craziness and intolerance would end up at a mainstream outlet. So I'll shut up.
Well, I agree. The left is freaking out. There's no disputing that. I mean, there is a something paradoxical going on, which is people are saying, one, he doesn't have a mandate, but two, Democrats have work to do. I mean, I think both things are true. I think everyone recognizes what happened on the map, but there's a whole lot of different ways you can interpret what happened on the map and how you respond to it. So there's definitely a push to lean much harder on economic populism because there's a whole lot of "I told you so" from the Bernie camp, not Bernie himself necessarily, but people who supported him saying, well, if we had him and not her, he would have won. There's other folks saying, well, that removes all these issues about race and gender and immigration that Bernie was not lined up with Trump on, and those things might have had a greater factor than the economics, and it's hard to separate those two things completely because both things that clearly occurred. So you have folks who are in the Senate looking to have a little bit of an olive branch to Trump, saying, hey, if you want to do an infrastructure bill, let's talk about that. And let's talk about what our next steps are on trade, because we have some common ground there. You have a protest movement coming out of the left saying we're going to primary any Democrat that compromises with Trump. Now, that is targeted at Schumer being the incoming Democratic leader in the Senate, and widely seen on the left as similarly too close to Wall Street as Clinton was. But Sanders and Warren have also suggested they would work with Trump on infrastructure and trade while fighting him on other things. So it's not settled, and maybe never will be settled definitively. There's no single person that decides which way the left goes. Do you deal with Trump with total opposition, or do you have to meet him halfway in those areas where he is economically populist and clearly won votes in the Rust Belt and elsewhere, at least partially on those grounds, even if it is intertwined with other unsavory aspects? So those are very difficult questions for the left going forward. But I don't think that makes it inherently dangerous to point out, hey, you don't have a mandate here. Your election was exceedingly tenuous, even on electoral college grounds. The electoral map amplifies an extraordinarily narrow victory in several states that were less than 2 points. So I mean, this happened with Bill Clinton in 1992. When Bob Dole literally the next day says, I'm going to represent the 57% of Americans that didn't vote for this guy. And Clinton decided to deprioritize his middle-class tax cut and instead pursue deficit reduction, very controversially, arguably hurt him in the midterm, but when the deficit went down and the economy improved, and you might dispute whether the two things are linked or not, that got a chunk of those Perot voters back on his side, and his total in 96 was better than 1992. So it's not wrong or dangerous to point out. I mean, it could be constructive for Trump to recognize, hey, I don't have this thing in the bag. I can't win a second time exactly the same way.
No. I think Trump, like I said, I think Trump should recognize that that this is not an overwhelming mandate, and that he has to continue to persuade and earn people's support. But I think it's a huge mistake for the left and for Democrats to basically say, half the population and the people who won the Electoral College are bad people. That there is no such thing as a good Trump voter, and that anybody who voted against Hillary Clinton did so because she's a woman, and they are harboring some sort of misogyny. I mean, that's the kind of stuff. That doesn't mean that it's what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer think, but that is the stuff I'm seeing in these liberal think pieces coming from pretty prominent not by me, but people who are welcomed and respected in the mainstream as liberal opinion leaders are suggesting. I think that's bad for the left to believe. It's not good for them, and it's certainly not good for America.
I have a lot to say on this subject. I'm currently working on an article on this subject, so I'm going to restrain myself for the moment.
Okay. Well, this is a great tease, then. We should read this piece. Where might we find it?
Well, I literally haven't written a word of it yet. I mean, it's
okay.
But it's in the works. Hopefully, it'll be out by the time we talk next week, and we can delve into the subject further.
Okay. Well,
I want to talk about the right for a bit.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Is there are troubles on both sides of this thing right now?
So you have Paul Ryan, who was clearly uncomfortable with Trump in the election, although he never outright renounced his endorsement. He wouldn't campaign with him, wouldn't defend him when he got into trouble. Now gives a press conference where he's beaming, "Welcome to the new dawn of Republican control of Washington." He's talking about all these wonderful, the better way agenda that he had been stumping on. That's all squeaky clean, ready to go. He's even talking about, reforming Medicare, something that Donald Trump did not talk about in his stump. So you have that optimistic spring in his step faction of the party. You have Elliot Cohen, who's a prominent national security figure in conservative circles, who initially had said, conservatives, if you weren't for Trump, you should work with his administration and have him be as good as possible. Renounced that sentiment. He said, after I talked to the transition team, my message is stay away. These people are vindictive. They are chastising those of us who were skeptical of him, saying, you lost, you have no business being here. This is a toxic environment. Everyone should stay away from it. You have a whole lot of people going on in the transition team. You have and there's the whole Stephen Bannon question. Stephen Bannon being a lightning rod of criticism for his white nationalist ties. So if you're a conservative, if you're a Republican, are you saying to yourself, Matt Lewis, or what do you think is reflective in town, this is our shot to pass the big things we've wanted to pass, or is there an undercurrent of trepidation, OMG, our wagon is hooked to this deeply unstable person who's surrounding himself with a lot of unsavory characters. This could end very badly for us.
Both. I mean, I think this is where we've always been with Donald Trump, is this huge high-risk, high-reward situation. I'm cautiously optimistic right now. I mean, I think that you've got Mike Pence as vice president. You've got Reince Priebus as his chief of staff. You're probably going to have Kellyanne Conway involved at some level. I think that so much of the Obama administration's legacy and policies are very tenuous, and for example, the Iranian deal wasn't a treaty. You've got a lot of stuff that were basically executive orders that can be reversed on day one. You've got a chance. I agree with President Obama. And by the way, I think President Obama has been very responsible these last several days since the election and sort of encouraging this peaceful transfer of power. But I agree with President Obama that I think Trump is much more of a pragmatist than an ideologue. I think he's a deal maker. I think that you could do something on infrastructure that would be bipartisan. So there's a part of me that's very optimistic about this. There's a part of me looking at history that thinks this is sort of like Reagan. Remember, the Democrats wanted Reagan to run against Carter. They were rooting for Reagan because they thought he'd be easy to beat. Now, granted, it's hard. I don't want to compare Reagan to Reagan, who was a two-term governor, to Donald Trump, but he was an outsider. A lot of people were scared of him. He did things that were very unorthodox, based on the way things were at the time. And there were a lot of people like George Will who were critical of Reagan. and skeptical of him, even on the right. They didn't like the fact that he cited Thomas Paine. And now they kind of look foolish. Ronald Reagan ended up being, I think most people would say, a great president or a near great president. And certainly if you're on the right, someone that is lionized. And so I think there's a danger to sitting on the sidelines and continuing to criticize Trump, because you may end up looking very foolish if it turns out that Trump does make America great again, and the economy could turn around, and he could end up being a pretty darn good president. There's the other side of it, which is that this thing could go south. This could get, Richard Nixon, Joe McCarthy territory, and there's clearly going to be a lot of infighting. There's people like Steve Bannon. I do not think Steve Bannon is a white supremacist, as some have alleged, but certainly his website has helped normalize the alt-right movement to some degree. So do you want to be affiliated and aligned with that? And, people like Paul Ryan and even me, I mean, we have spent years trying to establish a reputation of being, intellectually honest and thoughtful conservatives, and to talk about how conservatism was a philosophy that could lift everybody up. Politics is not a zero-sum game, and at some point, if we become too attached or affiliated with Trumpism, and it falls apart, then we will have, I think, delegitimized ourselves and tarnished our reputations for something that we never honestly were supportive of. We just kind of said, hey, this is now our guy. So this is fraught with danger. There's damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? If you don't support Trump and he ends up, being successful, then you look stupid. And if you do support Trump and then something beyond your control goes off the rails, you end up looking stupid. So Trump, once again, has put us in a very kind of a bind here.
Well, I want to talk about Bannon for a bit, but I don't want to talk about the white nationalist component. Not that I think it's not important. I mean, I certainly encourage those who oppose him on those grounds to voice that opposition, but I think that's being well litigated elsewhere. I don't know if we have to talk about that. What I think is more what's worth exploring for us, he is a voice of right-wing populism and anti-globalism. And his loyalty is not to the Republican Party, it's to this anti-globalist right-wing populist movement. And he sees Paul Ryan as being on the other side of where he is. So my question to you is, you're looking at Reince Priebus and Mike Pence as comforting, Kellyanne Conway as comforting as elements in Trump's inner circle, but Bannon seems to loom very large. Trump is someone who has no intrinsic loyalty to the party. He's someone who seems to just enjoy picking fights for the sake of picking fights. He seems to thrive on conflict. So is there a need for Paul Ryan and other intellectual conservatives to, have some lines to draw to say, look, there are some things that we're not going to be comfortable with, and if we don't voice them publicly or at least privately, we might get swept up in the fervor and lose our bearings.
Yeah, look, there's a danger, and I think it's fair to say that that Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and Paul Ryan is still the Speaker. Now he's in a tough spot because a lot of his members are in districts where Donald Trump is more popular than they are, and much more popular than Paul Ryan. So but so he doesn't have the most leverage. But again, I think that that our founders very wisely pit ambition against ambition and created a system of checks and balances. We are blessed to have that system that prevents the passions of the mob from sort of sweeping radical change. I mean, we complain about gridlock and how slow things go, but this is a feature, not a bug. So the optimistic side of me says, look, a president's basically entitled to have whoever he wants advising him. Would I want Steve Bannon to be the only guy whispering in his ear? No. I've known Steve Bannon for 5 or 6 years. We don't play golf together. We don't hang out. But I just rebroadcast a podcast interview I did with him from 2011 when he had his documentary, The Undefeated, about Sarah Palin. And look, would I want Steve Bannon being the only guy whispering in Donald Trump's ear? Probably not. But if I'm Donald Trump and I have Reince Priebus and Mike Pence and Kellyanne Conway and others, would I want someone as brilliant, if eccentric, as Steve Bannon? Yes. I think he's a very sharp, smart guy. He's a fighter. And I think if he's part of a well-balanced diet, that his insight could be helpful in a sport, in a game that's brutal and that sometimes it takes somebody who's tough. And look, I'm a conservative, free market, free trade kind of guy. But you've got people like Larry Kudlow, who very well could be offering, he was a free marketer who very well could be offering advice from Treasury or wherever. Bannon represents a different viewpoint, a different part of the right wing that is populist and protectionist. There is a market for that. I think that the public, the sort of the conservative base, has been underrepresented in having people who represent that viewpoint. And if you want to win Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania in the future, it'd be smart for President Trump to have somebody pushing that agenda in his ear. Best case scenario, it helps us negotiate better trade deals. I don't think we're going to end up in a trade war with China. I'm very skeptical that Trump is actually going to impose, tariffs or anything like that. But who knows? This is a great unknown. We don't know how it's going to shake out. I just think that there are a lot of people wringing their hands and clutching their pearls right now about this scary guy being in the White House. I'm not that freaked out yet.
Well, trade is one area where Congress may not get to weigh in. I mean, Trump could exit NAFTA on his own, and there's already a draft transition memo that CNN got its hands on that talks about a 200-day trade strategy where they enter into renegotiations on NAFTA immediately, and the prospect of pulling out of NAFTA altogether if those negotiations don't go well seems to be a live, first-year possibility. Although then they said we realize there could be negative consequences, but we can mitigate that by having bilateral deals. Of course, if you pull out first and the bilateral negotiations don't resolve themselves quickly, you might well get a price spike, a price shock off the bat. So that's being talked about, I think, more on the left. I don't think the right's really paying attention to this. You have a threat from the Trump team that they're going to want to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, which, technically speaking, since it's in effect, they can't do that immediately. It would take a 4-year period, although I think there's ways that the Trump team is trying to do an end around that provision of the agreement. But Sarkozy, the former French president who's running again...
I prefer to call him Sarkozy.
He has suggested that if America doesn't follow through on its climate commitments, that France should level a carbon tariff on America. And other countries might well feel the same way. So you might start a trade war on that front, in addition to or instead of NAFTA. And I don't think that there is a greater desire on the part of conservatives to be free marketers that might have some restraining pressure on Trump. There is almost no pro-green faction of the Republican Party that would restrain him when it comes to climate. So you might have a trade war on that front regardless, because the staying in Paris might just be seemingly untenable for Republican or conservative to do. Those are just a couple of tripwires that are out there.
I think as far as conservatives are concerned, he's going to get to name a Supreme Court justice right away. He's going to get to cancel out 25 on day one. I don't know how many Obama executive orders. And if he does a great job with the Supreme Court and can put in justices in the mold of Antonin Scalia, that's going to be much more important. I mean, than like if he's somewhat of a protectionist on trade. Like,
well, that's maybe more important as far as making conservatives happy.
Yes,
but if you have economic disruption, that could well have ramifications for 2018 or 2020.
Sure. We don't disagree. We don't disagree on that. But forgive me if I'm relitigating old ground. But when you look at the transition so far, when you look at not just the people who are, so you talk about Priebus and Conway and Pence. You know, there's also Giuliani. There's also Christie, although he's a bit sidelined right now. You know, they just brought in Frank Gaffney, who is seen as virulently Islamophobic. There's Myron Ebel on the climate side, who's a climate science denier. When you look at the totality of the people around him, I mean, Reagan went out of his way to really have a broad range of the Republican Party around him. Caused him some problems. There was a lot of dissension in his administration. He was not always adept at resolving it. But there are definitely enlightened folks in the mix. Do you think he has put together a Reagan-style team, or is this more of a Warren Harding-style team where you have a bunch of essentially corrupt people and a guy at the top who has zero interest in patrolling his administration, and that's just a recipe for just straight-up scandal, sloppy policy making, and general chaos? I don't know yet. I can tell you that, number one, the people who are now freaking out are late to the game. I was worried about this when I opposed him in the Republican primary and when I didn't support him in the general election. And so now, all of a sudden, people are like, what? He's going to have Rudy Giuliani and Newt Gingrich in his administration, or Mike Flynn? I mean, like, I dealt with this. I went through this process of dealing with this and accepting this months ago. So I don't know why people are now all of a sudden up in arms about it. But, you know, I don't think it's all that bad, like I said. So you've got the chief of staff is Reince Priebus, who I think is widely respected as a sort of an establishment Republican, competent, decent guy. His vice president's Mike Pence, former congressman, governor of Indiana, social conservative, fiscal conservative. You've got, so you might have Rudy Giuliani at state, possibly, or AG. This is a guy who was the mayor of America, mayor of New York City during a very important time, obviously, of 9/11. By almost all accounts, conducted himself extremely well during that trying time. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, obviously qualified to serve in the administration. They're talking about Mike Flynn, former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I mean, people are talking about Bolton, who's, it's weird, he's a neocon. And
I would not call Bolton a neocon.
Well, okay, so maybe that's not the exact word. He's a hawk.
I would call Bolton a nationalist, maybe a bit more militaristic, a more militaristic nationalist than Trump. I think Trump and Bolton are similarly nationalistic. Bolton doesn't care about democracy promotion. You know, I think that separates him from a neocon.
Trump is very militaristic, as he has said. So anyway, my point being that you can't say that these are like inexperienced, unserious people. Mike Rogers looks like he's sidelined. Chris Christie looks like he's sidelined. There's going to end up being, 4,000 or so bureaucrats who are appointees. Most of them we will have never heard of. Most of them, but they'll be making decisions. But look, I don't think it's amateur hour. It's being made out to be. I mean, these are generally serious people. So, I guess Ben Carson decided, although he ran for president, that he wasn't up to running an agency. But otherwise, look, I'll just say I'm cautiously optimistic. But the way it's being portrayed by some in the media, I think is overwrought.
Time will tell. I got to jump.
Yes. All right.
But we'll have much more to say next week here on the DMZ.
Yeah, and I want to read that piece of yours about the left freak out, and I want to encourage everyone to check out my podcast with my mom, who voted for Trump in Pennsylvania, Matt Lewis in the News podcast. See you guys.
Absolutely. Till next week, sir.
All right, thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye.